In 1937, the Japanese declared war on China and invaded their country. The United States, who was friends with China, initially did not intervene in fear of provoking Japan. But after the Japanese murdered hundreds of thousands of unarmed Chinese civilians, and the Japanese attacked an American warship, the United States was forced to step in. American officials responded to the Japanese aggression by placing serious economic sanctions and trade embargoes on Japan, believing this would hurt their war efforts in China, causing them to have to retreat. However, these sanctions and embargoes did not have this effect. Instead, they just angered Japan and made them even more determined to hold their ground in China. Over the next few years, the United States and Japan attempted to negotiate some sort of settlement, but neither side would make any concessions, and so neither side would budge. A few years later, on the morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise aerial attack on the American military base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. After the 2-hour attack was done, over 2,400 Americans were killed, with another 1,000 wounded, and 300 airplanes and 20 ships were either destroyed or significantly crippled. The Japanese had hoped this attack would goad the United States into lifting the sanctions and embargoes they had placed on them from back in 1937. But instead, all the Japanese did was goad the United States into all-out war with them. One day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States officially declared war on Japan, thus entering World War II. On the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Jack Lucas, like every other American in the country, was glued to his radio, listening to the news. He was devastated and shocked at this carnage he was hearing about in Hawaii. And so, by the time the President of the United States was declaring war on Japan, Jack had already made up his mind that he was going to join up, and he was going to fight for his country. However, there was an issue. Jack wasn't old enough to join the military. You needed to be 17 years old. And Jack was only 14. But this was not going to stop Jack. So, he created this fake document that said he was 17 years old, and he forged his mother's signature on it. And then, after bribing him, he got a notary to sign off on this document as well. And so, Jack took his forged documentation. He gave it to the recruiter, and before long, Jack was accepted into the armed services and was on his way to Marine Corps boot camp. After completing initial training and becoming a Marine, the Marines found out Jack's paperwork was actually faked. But instead of kicking him out of the military, they said, "Jack, you can stay in, but under one condition. You can't go overseas to combat. You have to stay in the United States. You can drive a truck and help out around here, but you can't deploy and go to war until you're of age." Jack was not happy about this, but initially, he did as he was told. And he did just drive a truck around and support it as best as he could. But after about a year and a half, 2 years of this, Jack just couldn't do it anymore. That was not why he had forged this document, to get into the military. He had done that so he could actually go fight in the war. And so finally, when he was just 16 years old, he abandoned his post and snuck onto the back car of a troop transport train that was going to another military base. And so, when he arrived at this base, which was in California, he hopped off and then ran to the docks where there were these big warships. And he saw one of them, there was a whole bunch of troops loading onto it. And he figured, that's where I need to go. And so, he snuck onto the ship and he hid down below. And then, after the ship took off and was out to sea, he revealed himself. And he walked up to a Marine officer and he kind of played off the, "Oh, I must have got on the wrong ship. But you know, now that I'm here, can I join your unit?" And this officer, who had no idea how young Jack was, eventually said, "Okay, but prepare yourself, because we're going to invade Yoima." Now, Jack had never heard of Yoima and did not know its significance. But frankly, Jack didn't really care. He was just glad that he was actually going to see combat. What Jack couldn't have known, and what the other Marines on this ship couldn't have known either, is that the battle for Yoima would become one of the bloodiest and deadliest battles of the entire war. The Japanese that were on this island defending it were absolutely fearless, and would not surrender, despite being outnumbered. and they were heavily entrenched in these caves and tunnels built in all over the island. And they rarely left these caves and tunnels, which meant Jack and the other Marines, when they landed on this island, the only way they could fight the Japanese was by literally crawling down into these tunnels, which were usually booby-trapped, and fighting up close and personal with the enemy. Jack's ship arrived off the coast of Yoima in February of 1945, when Jack was still 16 years old. On February 19th, the first wave of Marines climbed down the side of this big ship down onto these smaller amphibious landing crafts. And then, one by one, they began making their way towards Yoima to begin the invasion. Jack was not part of this initial invasion. He would be going out on day 2 with the second wave of Marines. And so, Jack and all the other second wave Marines just stood at the front of the ship and watched as these amphibious crafts made it up to the beach, and then just got completely gunned down by Japanese machine gunners that were lining the beach. And so, by the second day, when Jack and the rest of the Marines are getting ready to launch their assault, there are literally thousands of dead Americans just lining the beach. But Jack and the other second wave Marines, they knew this was their job. This was their duty. And so, they were undeterred. They climbed down the side of the ship. They boarded their amphibious landing craft and began the journey towards the island. As they got closer, the Japanese machine gunners opened fire, not only on Jack and the boat he was in, but all of the crews that were coming towards the beach. And so, hundreds of Americans were just getting gunned down before they even reached the sand. Jack and his crew managed to get to the beach. And so, as the gate dropped on their boat, and as Jack is running onto the beach, the men around him are just getting cut to pieces by these machine guns. Jack manages not to get shot, and he, along with 3 other Marines, run up the beach and they lay down in front of the sand dune that protected them from these machine gunners. Jack knew he couldn't stay there for very long because the Japanese were also firing artillery shells onto the beach. And so, it would just be a matter of time before he was blown up. And so, Jack and these other 3 Marines that had arrived at the same time, they began moving north, doing their best not to get shot or blown up, stopping behind rocks and trees and jumping behind sand dunes. And after a couple hours of doing this, the 4 of them reached the airfield at the northern end of the island. And when they get there, a machine gunner inside of a pillbox. A pillbox is like a small concrete fort that only has openings on 3 or 4 of its sides that are just big enough for a machine gun to poke through. A machine gunner inside one of these pillboxes notices Jack and the other 3 Marines, and they open fire on them. And somehow, Jack and these other 3 Marines managed to not get shot and were able to maneuver and then fire through one of those openings and take out the machine gunner inside. And so, now that this gunner is down, Jack and the others see the opportunity to run forward and take more ground of this airfield. And as they're running, other Japanese soldiers in the general vicinity, they see them. They start opening up on them from other pillboxes and other locations. And it forces Jack and these Marines to just jump into the nearest trench to avoid getting shot. And so, they're jumping into a Japanese trench, which is a deep hole dug in the ground to protect yourself from getting shot. And as they jump in there, they're expecting to see Japanese soldiers coming towards them. But there weren't any soldiers. But they knew they couldn't stay there for very long, because eventually, Japanese soldiers would come through here, and then, they'd get killed. And so, they quickly decided their best bet was to basically get out of this trench and run towards the pillbox where they knew they had taken out the machine gunner inside, so they could actually take that pillbox for themselves. And so, their plan was they would run towards it and stop inside of each of the trenches along the way to protect themselves, because they know there are other Japanese that know where they are. And then, once they get to the pillbox, they can regroup and call in reinforcements. And so, one of the men Jack was with said, "Okay, go first." And so, he climbs out of his trench as the Japanese are shooting at him, and he sprints about 10 or 15 feet until he gets to the next trench on the way to this pillbox. And so, Jack is watching as this guy jumps into this trench, and as soon as he disappears out of view, this Marine is immediately turning around and scrambling to get back out of the trench. And he's trying to run back towards Jack and the other 2 Marines he was with. It would turn out this guy had jumped into another Japanese trench that was full of Japanese soldiers. He had actually landed on top of an actual soldier. But these Japanese soldiers were so caught off guard by this, they didn't have time to react and shoot this Marine before the Marine was able to scramble out and get back to Jack and the others. And then, for the next several minutes, Jack and these other 3 Marines opened fire on these Japanese soldiers in this trench, like 10 or 15 feet away. And these Japanese soldiers, they too, opened fire on Jack and the other 3. Jack was able to take out 2 of the Japanese soldiers before his gun jammed. And so, he ducked down into the trench to work on his gun. And as he's down there, he notices there are 2 grenades on the ground right next to him. And so, without any hesitation, he yells, "Grenade," to the other Marines. And then, he jumps on top of them, smothering the grenades with his body. One of the grenades was a dud, and so it didn't explode. The other was not a dud, and it went off. The way a grenade works is, there is a small piece of explosive that is inside of metal housing that's usually spherical. And this metal housing is the thing you actually hold on to and throw when you throw a grenade. And so, when this small explosive is triggered by pulling the pin and releasing the spoon, it detonates, and it causes the metal housing itself to be ripped apart and sent flying. Basically, when a grenade goes off, it's like having hundreds of pieces of jagged metal shot off in every direction that are all traveling roughly at the speed of a bullet, or faster. And so, naturally, a grenade up close is incredibly lethal. In fact, the kill radius of a typical fragmentation grenade is about 5 meters. When the grenade under Jack that was not a dud exploded, it sent Jack flying into the air. And then, when he came back down again, his comrades saw him, and they could see he was clearly devastated from all the fragmentation that had been pumped into his body. And so, they assumed he was dead. But even if they thought he was alive, for some reason, there was nothing they could have done to have helped him, because they were actively being engaged by dozens of Japanese soldiers that were only about 10 or 15 feet away. And so, eventually, these 3 other Marines that Jack had just saved were forced to leave Jack where he was and retreat back to the beach, and they would all live. The Japanese soldiers in the trench that they were fighting against would eventually come into Jack's trench. But most likely, when they saw Jack laying there, just completely ruined from this grenade, they assumed he was dead, and so they just kind of left him there. But Jack wasn't dead. He just couldn't speak, and he couldn't see anything, and he really couldn't move. Although, he could wiggle a few fingers on his left hand. And so, for hours, as he laid there in agonizing pain, in and out of consciousness, he just wiggled the fingers on his left hand, hoping an American would see him and know he was still alive. And you got to figure, this whole time, it is just constant chaos all around him. His chances of survival are incredibly slim. The idea that an American is going to find him and be able to evacuate him is almost zero. And he must have known that. But by some miracle, eventually, another American unit did find their way into Jack's trench. And they did notice him wiggling the fingers on his left hand. And so, they were able to evacuate him from the trench down to the beach. And from there, under the cover of darkness, they were able to bring him out to a hospital boat offshore. And there, he would begin the first of 26 major surgeries to remove the grenade shrapnel from his torso, his arm, and his face. Despite his grievous injuries, Jack would surprisingly make a full recovery. And 8 months after his injury, the President of the United States would award him the highest decoration for bravery, the Medal of Honor. He would be the youngest recipient of this award since the 1800s, and to this day, he is one of only a handful of miners to have won this award. Following his departure from the military, Jack would survive a near-death experience while skydiving, when both of his parachutes, his main and his reserve, failed, and he just smashed into the ground, but somehow lived. He would also survive a very bad house fire, and he would survive an assassination attempt on his life by his ex-wife. And so, naturally, he titled his memoir Indestructible. Jack would eventually die of natural causes on June 5, 2008. He was 80 years old. In October of 2014, A 35-year-old woman we'll call Olivia met her husband for lunch at a restaurant in western New York. The couple hadn't originally planned to stay very long, but one thing led to another. They were having a nice time, and before they knew it, it was 6 p.m. They'd been there for 6 hours. Over those 6 hours, both of them had eaten a lot: bread, pasta, cakes, all sorts of things. They'd also had some alcohol, but not much. Olivia had been careful to have only 4 drinks over that time, because she wanted to be able to drive. Her husband had similarly limited his drinking, so he would also be safe to drive. When they finally got the check and paid for their meal, they each got into their own cars and started driving home. As Olivia was making her way home, she unfortunately got a flat tire. She pulled over to the side of the road and called roadside assistance. While she was waiting for help to arrive, another motorist drove by and misunderstood what was happening. They saw Olivia standing outside her car with the tire removed and assumed she'd been in an accident, so they called the police to report it. A few minutes later, officers arrived. They pulled up behind Olivia, got out, and asked if she was okay and whether she needed help. Olivia explained, "Oh no, I just had a flat tire. I'm totally fine. Thank you for stopping, though." But as the police listened to her speak, they noticed her eyes looked glassy and glazed over, almost as if she were drunk. As she continued talking, they could have sworn she was slurring her words. So they asked, "Ma'am, have you been drinking tonight?" She said, "Well, yes, I have had a few drinks, but only 4 over the last 6 hours. I don't feel drunk at all. That has nothing to do with the situation. I'm not intoxicated." The police weren't convinced. They put her through a series of field sobriety tests, which she managed to complete, but she struggled enough to raise red flags. So they had her blow into a breathalyzer. A breathalyzer uses your breath to measure how much alcohol is in your system, your blood alcohol content, or BAC for short. BAC is measured as a percentage out of 100. While no one should ever drive while impaired, in America, you are legally allowed to operate a vehicle if your BAC is 0.08% or lower. For reference, if a 160-pound woman consumed about 3 alcoholic drinks in an hour, she would likely have a BAC around 0.08%. If she drank 8 alcoholic drinks in an hour, her BAC would spike to around 0.20, which would likely cause alcohol poisoning and eventually loss of consciousness. If she consumed 13 drinks in an hour, her BAC could reach 0.4% or higher, an extremely dangerous level where death becomes a real possibility. When Olivia blew into the breathalyzer, she fully expected her BAC to be well below the legal limit. After all, she'd only had 4 drinks over 6 hours. But that wasn't the case. She blew a staggering 0.33% BAC. The officers couldn't believe it. At that level, she should have been somewhere between unconscious and dying. Yet here she was, standing there, talking to them, acting just a little buzzed. They assumed their breathalyzer must be broken, so they retrieved another one from the car and tested her again. Again, Olivia blew a 0.33% BAC. The officers couldn't understand how this woman could tolerate so much alcohol. Regardless, they charged her with driving while intoxicated and took her to the hospital for medical care. Even after a full day had passed without Olivia consuming any more alcohol, her BAC remained dangerously high. It was around this time that doctors discovered Olivia had a very rare medical condition called Brewery syndrome, which, in a nutshell, meant her body transformed glucose from food, especially carbs like bread and pasta, into alcohol. Olivia, who had been completely unaware of this condition, had developed an extreme alcohol tolerance because she was essentially drunk all the time, not from drinking, but from eating carbs. If left untreated, this condition can do the same damage to the body as chronic alcoholism and binge drinking. The only effective treatment is to drastically change the diet. When Olivia's condition was discovered and made public, the charges against her were dropped. She eventually stopped eating carbs altogether. Late 90s and early 2000s. In 2001, when Johnny was 18 years old, he had made enough money from acting that he was able to leave his parents' home in North Los Angeles and move into a new place right in Hollywood with a bunch of other up-and-coming actors and actresses. By 2006, when Johnny was 23, he was riding high. He had landed several more big TV roles, including a recurring part in the show The OC, which was very popular in the 2000s. In 2006, he was dating the mega pop star Katy Perry. Although their romance was relatively short, it was apparently very intense, because Katy would go on to write 2 songs that were reportedly about Johnny. But Johnny's real rise to stardom occurred 2 years later, in 2008, when he was cast as the character Half-Sack on the critically acclaimed motorcycle drama Sons of Anarchy. While the show made him famous and fabulously wealthy, Johnny was growing concerned about the direction the series was taking. He felt like it was becoming too violent. Johnny liked reading poetry, studying philosophy, staying up late drinking tea, and playing chess. He did not like acting out scenes of gratuitous violence. It just wasn't who he was. So after being on the show for 2 very successful seasons, he was a very popular character. He went to the writers and said, "You've got to write me out of the script. I can't do this anymore." The writers were totally caught off guard and begged him to stay, but he had made up his mind. In 2009, his character was killed off. After leaving Sons of Anarchy, Johnny decided he wasn't going to pursue any serious acting roles for the time being. Instead, he wanted to focus on writing his first novel, which was about a musical genius trying to make his way in the world. So he started asking around to see if anyone knew of a quiet place he could live and write. His photographer said, "I think I know the place." It was called the Writer's Villa, a beautiful house with 6 bedrooms for rent right outside Hollywood. Over the years, it had become a sort of safe haven for up-and-coming actors and actresses still looking for their big break. The reason it developed this reputation was because of the owner, Kathy Davis. She was a wonderful woman who really understood how difficult it was to break into Hollywood. She would look after her tenants, make them food, offer them rides, and stay up late listening to their frustrations, being a shoulder to cry on if they didn't get the part they wanted. Many of her tenants, who later became big Hollywood stars, would later attribute their success at least in part to the time they spent with Kathy at the villa, which they remembered as therapeutic and soothing. Even though Johnny had already had his big break on Sons of Anarchy, he loved the idea of living in such a peaceful place that catered to eccentric artists like himself. So in April 2009, Johnny called Kathy and requested a room. She said, "Absolutely, you can stay on the 2nd floor in the red suite." After moving in, Johnny told his friends the writer's villa was just as amazing as he'd hoped. Kathy specifically was as wonderful as everyone said. He actually struck up a friendship with her almost immediately. Everything seemed to be going really well in Johnny's life until a few months later, when he found out his girlfriend, Diane, was pregnant. Although this totally disrupted his plans for the novel, Johnny was really excited about being a father. He decided to move out of the villa and in with Diane, who lived nearby, to help take care of their child. 9 months later, on April 6, 2010, Diane gave birth to a healthy little girl named Colame, and Johnny and Diane fell madly in love with her. Unfortunately, Johnny and Diane's love for each other faded quickly after becoming parents. Before long, Johnny moved out and back in with his parents. Not long after that, Johnny and Diane became embroiled in a really vicious custody battle over Colame, which Johnny ultimately lost. It was devastating for him. A few months later, in October 2011, when Johnny was still living with his parents, he decided to take his motorcycle out to clear his head. He drove about 2 hours west of LA into the desert, where he lost control of his bike and crashed. At the hospital, his injuries were determined to be relatively minor, though doctors were concerned he might have a head injury. But after testing negative for a concussion, he was sent to be okay and sent home. However, when he returned home, he was not okay. He was a totally different person. Johnny's father, Michael, immediately noticed the change in his son's behavior. He began acting very strange and erratic, and his thoughts weren't always coherent, and he was really agitated all the time. It was very obvious that something was off. It made Michael wonder, perhaps my son did get a head injury from that motorcycle accident, and the doctors just missed it. So Michael scheduled 2 separate MRIs for Johnny, but for whatever reason, Johnny refused to go. Around this time, Johnny's friends also began noticing his strange behavior. In December of that year, he was at an acting class when he suddenly began speaking in a vaguely British accent. Everyone in the class noticed. Eventually someone asked, "Hey, why are you doing that?" Johnny just looked confused and said, "What?" He shrugged it off and acted like he hadn't done anything unusual. A few weeks later, on the morning of January 3rd, 2012, Johnny was at his parents' house, sitting in the kitchen while his mom was making omelets. Johnny abruptly announced, "I'm going to go out for a walk." He got up, wearing only his pajamas and no shoes, and walked out the door. As he walked down the road, he had gotten maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the house when he heard someone screaming, like they were in distress. He thought the screams were coming from the apartment right next door to his parents' home. He broke into the apartment, but there was no one there. It was completely vacant. As he stood there trying to understand what was going on, the two men who owned the apartment came home. They saw Johnny standing inside and told him he needed to leave immediately. Instead of leaving, Johnny grabbed a nearby glass bottle, charged at them, and struck them both over the head before they managed to restrain him and hold him down until the police arrived. Johnny claimed he was acting in self-defense, but the police didn't believe him. They charged him with trespassing, burglary, and assault with a deadly weapon, then took him to jail. When Johnny's father was finally able to come to the jail and bail him out, it had been 8 days. During those 8 days, Johnny had been moved from general population to a psych ward because he was banging his head against the inside of his cell. At one point, he had tried to jump off a balcony, and he was generally acting unhinged. When he was discharged, a doctor at the jail noted in his paperwork that he believed Johnny must have had some sort of head injury that was causing his behavior and that he was definitely suicidal. When Johnny got back to his parents' house, he was an absolute wreck. Physically, he had 2 black eyes and a swollen face from the confrontation with the 2 men. Emotionally, he was so distraught he wouldn't let anyone in his family come near him. He holed up in his room and told everyone to stay away. He also became extremely sensitive to light, to the point where he began turning off all the lights in the house. When his parents turned them back on, he would get agitated and turn them off again. Finally, he disabled the fuse box completely. Despite Johnny's obvious issues, over the next few weeks, he actually seemed to be improving. By the end of January, about a month after he came home from jail, his parents allowed him to move out and live on his own in Santa Monica, about 30 minutes away. But as soon as he was on his own, the trouble started again. On February 10th, about a week after moving into his place in Santa Monica, he was arrested for punching a random stranger in the head outside a yogurt shop. He was ultimately released on $20,000 bail. A couple of days later, Johnny, fully clothed, walked straight into the ocean. When he was pulled out, he had to be taken to the hospital for treatment of hypothermia. A few days after being released from the hospital, he was arrested again, this time for trying to break into a woman's apartment in Santa Monica. He claimed he thought it was his friend's apartment, but no one believed him. He was jailed again, and then released on bail. After the second arrest in Santa Monica, Johnny's parents finally convinced him to see a doctor about the possible head injury from the 2011 motorcycle crash. Even though the jailhouse doctor had suspected it, he hadn't formally diagnosed it, so Johnny needed another doctor's opinion before he could get treatment. But the doctor Johnny ended up seeing did not suspect a head injury. Instead, he suspected schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, 2 very serious mental illnesses. He prescribed medication that would treat both conditions. Johnny refused to take the medication and refused to see another doctor. His condition continued to worsen. Meanwhile, Johnny was still facing serious jail time for the break-in and assault of the 2 men in the apartment next to his parents' house. His lawyer was trying to arrange a deal where Johnny would go to a mental health treatment facility for a year instead of jail. But Johnny was so confident the charges would just get dropped, and that he'd be allowed to return to his life, that he fired his lawyer and represented himself in court. The charges were not dropped. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison. However, the jail he was sent to was so overcrowded that they reduced his sentence all the way down to only 6 weeks. When Johnny's father came to pick him up from prison on Friday, September 21, 2012, Johnny was at an all-time low. Even though he'd only been in jail for 6 weeks instead of a year, it was clear that time had done enormous damage. And so on the car ride home from prison, Johnny just kind of sheepishly asked his father, "Hey Dad, would it be possible if you called Kathy Davis at the writer's villa and just see if there's any way I can move back in?" Michael thought to himself, "I hadn't thought of that." But the writer's villa was the last place Johnny had been when his life was still in order. It was probably the last place he was happy, and so he probably had attached a lot of fond memories to that place. It seemed like a great place for him to go. As soon as they got home, Michael called Kathy Davis, explained the situation, and asked, "Is there any way he can stay there?" She said absolutely, the red suite was still available. She would go up and make the bed right then, and she couldn't wait to see him. Johnny stayed with his parents that weekend, and then on Monday, September 24th, he packed up his stuff and moved back into the villa. 2 days later, a 70-year-old man named Dan Blackburn, who was a neighbor of the writer's villa property, was looking out his front window. He noticed a man standing out in the road. He was wearing only jeans and red shoes, no shirt, and he was very sweaty. He was frantically pacing around in the road, and Dan had never seen him before. Dan was just kind of peeking out from behind his curtain, watching to see what the man was going to do next. After about 15 minutes of the strange pacing, the man turned and walked directly toward Dan's property. He went right up the front steps and started knocking on the door. Dan was definitely a little concerned. He shut the curtain, walked over to the door, and looked out the peephole. The man was standing there with bright blue eyes, wide open, staring into the peephole as if he could see straight through it and see Dan on the other side. Dan slowly reached down and opened the door just a little bit. He looked out, and the man said, "Hi, I'm John. I'm your new neighbor." It would turn out John was actually Johnny Lewis. Dan opened the door a little farther and said, "Hi, John. Nice to meet you." Before the two men could have any sort of conversation, Johnny abruptly turned around and walked away. Dan was completely puzzled by the strange interaction. He watched as Johnny walked back into the road, then back over to the villa, and disappeared inside. Dan shrugged it off, shut the door, locked it, and went back to his morning routine. About 30 minutes later, Dan was doing his own thing in the house when he heard his wife outside screaming for him to come outside. Dan ran out the front door and into the driveway, which was between his property and the writer's villa. He saw his wife standing there, horrified, pointing toward the back of their house. He looked over and saw Johnny Lewis standing on top of the man Dan and his wife had hired that day to paint their back deck. Johnny was raining blows down on the worker. He was also hitting him with a piece of wood. The worker was trying to shield himself, but there was blood all over him. Dan instinctively ran straight to Johnny. Johnny hadn't seen Dan yet. Dan got right up behind him, grabbed him by the shoulder, and tried to pull him off. He was screaming at Johnny to stop, but Johnny seemed totally unfazed. He just kept beating the worker. Finally, after Dan yanked on him hard enough, Johnny jumped up, turned around, and punched Dan square in the face. Dan fell to the ground. When he looked up, Johnny was just standing there, staring down at him. He was standing over Dan, looking at him with no expression on his face. It was like he didn't know what he was going to do with Dan next, so he just stood there, staring. But Dan wasn't going to waste any time. He jumped up and clocked Johnny square in the side of the head, but it had no effect. Johnny still just stood there, completely expressionless, staring at him. Dan grabbed a nearby lawn chair and practically broke it over Johnny's head. Again, it had no effect. Johnny just stood there, staring. At this point, Dan realized he needed to get everyone to safety. He grabbed the worker, who could barely stand, and ran with him back down the driveway. He grabbed his wife, and together the three of them sprinted toward the house. They managed to get inside, and as they were shutting the big, heavy door, Johnny came bounding up. He got right in front of it and jammed his arm into the space between the door and the wall so they couldn't close it. It kept getting stuck on his arm. All three of the adults inside, Dan, his wife, and the painter, put all of their weight against the huge wooden door, trying to force it shut while Johnny reached in, trying to grab them. Finally, the three of them started raising the door slightly, and then slamming it down as hard as they could onto Johnny's arm. After several hard blows, Johnny finally retracted his arm, and they were able to shut the door and lock it. At that point, Dan's wife and the painter ran around the house, closing every window and locking every door. Meanwhile, Dan went to a side window that looked out toward the writer's villa property. He got his phone out and called 911 while scanning the yard for any sign of Johnny. As he was explaining to the dispatcher what was happening, Johnny suddenly appeared. He was running down Dan's driveway as if he were heading back toward the back deck. But instead of continuing, he stopped almost right in front of Dan's window. Then he turned and started running toward the villa property. He came to a waist-high fence, and without breaking stride, he leapt clear over it. A moment later, he reached the huge wooden fence that surrounded the entire villa property, at least 8, maybe 9 or 10 feet tall, and he very easily grabbed the top and catapulted himself over it. Then he disappeared inside the villa. Within minutes, the police showed up. They went inside the villa, and they could not believe what they found. Based on the evidence, this is what investigators believe happened next. After Johnny had first walked up to Dan's property and awkwardly knocked on the door, saying, "Hi, I'm John. I'm your new neighbor," he had turned around, and Dan had watched him leave, returning inside the villa. Once Johnny got inside, he made his way up to the second floor, and he went into Kathy Davis's room. She was sitting there when Johnny came in. Kathy most likely turned and saw Johnny standing in the doorway. He had no shirt on. He was sweating. He looked totally crazed. She probably wasn't scared, at least not right away. Instead, her motherly instincts likely kicked in, and she probably said something like, "Hey, are you okay? Can I help you? What's going on?" And as she stood up and made her way over to check on him, Johnny, for reasons no one understands, proceeded to beat, kick, and strangle her. When she fell to the ground, totally helpless, Johnny either stomped on her skull repeatedly or struck her over the head with a rusty hammer that was later found in his bedroom. No matter how he did it, he managed to severely fracture her skull, and that's what ultimately killed her. After killing Kathy, Johnny tracked down her beloved cat and killed it the same way. Then, Johnny ran out of the villa. That's when he spotted Dan's house painter sitting outside, unaware of what had just happened. Johnny walked over to him and simply began beating him, just like the attack on Kathy and her cat. This assault appeared to have no motive at all. After Dan came outside and managed to fight Johnny off, and after Dan, his wife, and the painter ran inside and locked the door, Johnny stood outside for a few minutes. Then he ran down Dan's driveway and, right in front of Dan, hopped over the 2 fences and disappeared back inside the villa. Once he was inside, it's believed Johnny climbed up onto the upper patio or the roof of the villa itself. From there, he either jumped or fell to his death on the driveway below. His death was officially ruled an accident, not a suicide. After the news broke about what had happened at the writer's villa, everyone assumed Johnny must have been on some really hardcore drugs. That seemed like the only explanation for why someone would act the way he did. But when his toxicology report came back, it showed he had absolutely no drugs of any kind, legal or illegal, in his system. He was completely sober at the time he committed this horrible crime. Some believe Johnny really did have an undiagnosed head injury from his motorcycle accident, and that this injury was responsible for his violent outbursts. Others disagree and say the head injury had nothing to do with it, that Johnny clearly had some undiagnosed mental disorder. Maybe it was schizophrenia, maybe he was bipolar, maybe it was something else. But to this day, no one knows for sure why Johnny did what he did. All we know is that an innocent woman and her cat were needlessly killed.